May the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable in thy sight, O God, my rock and my redeemer. Amen. Amen. Today, we wrap up our journey through the Ten Commandments. We'll be examining Commandments 9 and 10 today that deal with coveting. These two commandments are often combined into one by other denominations, but Lutherans and Catholics in particular separate it into two. And we'll get into more particulars about that later. But these commandments come from the book of Exodus in chapter 20, verse 17. And the first part of the verse says, "You shall not covet your neighbor's house," which is our ninth commandment. Martin Luther explains the ninth commandment as, we should fear and love God, that we do not scheme to get our neighbor's inheritance or house, or get it in a way which only appears right, but help and be a service to him in keeping it. The second part of verse 17 addresses our 10th commandment and says, "You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or his male servant, or his female servant, or his ox, or his donkey, or anything that is your neighbor's." Luther goes on to explain this commandment by saying, "We should fear and love God, that we do not entice or force away our neighbor's wife, workers, or animals, or turn them against them, but urge them to stay and do their duty." For the purposes of this message, I'm going to combine these two commandments into one, as I said, as many other denominations do. If a distinction needs to be made between the two, I will let you know and say that. Otherwise, I'm just going to refer to them as one commandment. And as we go through these commandments, this commandment, we're going to look at four things. We're going to discover what coveting is. We're going to look at some of the sins and evils that come from coveting. We're going to understand why we even need these commandments in the first place. And then we're going to look at how we can use these commandments for good, for ourselves and for others. So first, what does it mean to covet? The Oxford Languages Dictionary defines covet as to yearn or possess to have something, as in he covets exercise and fishing. Now that definition to me sets a pretty low bar for coveting. I think we all yearn, desire to have something we don't have. But does that mean that we're coveting? I really don't think so. Our human nature leads us to want more, to want things that we don't have. But does that simple wanting rise to the level of what coveting really is? We'll see later. A few weeks ago, when we talked about the fifth commandment being, "You shall not murder," I opened that message with an example, an illustration, where I compared losing something that was very precious to me with how God feels when someone kills or murders one of his creation. And I know that that is not a valid comparison. Me losing something, a material thing, in no way equates to what God feels when someone is murdered. But I used that example just as a way to make you think about what we were going to be talking about further in that message. And my example that I used of something that I lost, those of you who were here may remember, my precious thing that I lost was my motorcycle. I sold my last motorcycle when I turned 60 as a promise to my wife. I told her I'd stop riding when I turned 60, so I sold it. and I miss that motorcycle to this day. And oftentimes, I will look at motorcycles online. I've gone by motorcycle shops and sat on them. I have looked at endless videos of different motorcycles. But does that mean that I'm coveting a motorcycle? I really don't think so. Coveting is much more than just wanting something. There's a resource that I use when I research messages like this. It's called the Baker Encyclopedia of the Bible. And it defines coveting as the desire to have something for oneself, a craving or passionate desire. To covet is to desire inordinately, to place the object of desire before love and devotion to God. Now that definition is worthy of a commandment. If we desire something to the point that it becomes an obsession for us, that it becomes something that is more important to us than God, that's a problem. And Paul addresses this situation in his letter to the Colossians, saying, "Put to death, therefore, what is earthly in you, fornication, impurity, passion, evil desire, and coveting, which is idolatry." Paul comes right out and says it in his letter. Coveting is having an idol. And that takes us back to the very first sermon that we had in this series. Back to Commandment 1. You shall have no other gods before me. So where does this inordinate desire come from? Of course, it comes from our sinful nature. As with many sinful things, we can trace the origin of coveting all the way back to Adam and Eve. Think about it. Why did they succumb to the serpent's temptation? The serpent told them, if you eat this fruit, you will be like God. Adam and Eve thought that they needed something they didn't have. They coveted what God had, and so they ate the fruit. Their hearts were corrupted by evil desires. And the Apostle Mark tells us in chapter 7 of his gospel, he talks about the heart when he says, for from within, out of the heart of man come evil thoughts, sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, coveting, wickedness, deceit, sensuality, envy, slander, pride, foolishness. Our hearts and minds have been corrupted ever since the first days of Genesis. And coveting is a grave sin that leads to other sins. And we'll look at some of those now. The first one we're going to look at is coveting can lead to injustice and oppression. We talked about this exact situation last week, injustice and oppression, when we talked about King Ahab and Naboth. You'll recall that Naboth had a vineyard next to King Ahab's palace. Ahab wanted that vineyard. And Naboth refused to sell it to him for good reason. It had been his inheritance. It had been in his family for a long time, and he did not want an evil king like Ahab to have it. So he coveted that vineyard. And as we talked about, Jezebel, his wife, found out about Ahab's desire for this, and she convinced some elders of the city to lie about Naboth and have him executed so that Ahab could have his vineyard. And, that clearly shows injustice and oppression. Injustice in that Naboth was convicted of something he didn't do. Oppression, they took something away that was not theirs to have. I have another example from more recent times that involved me. Several years ago, I worked for a company that was involved. We lent money to people that flipped houses. And for those of you that might not know, house flipping is where an investor buys a house, fixes it up, and resells it for a profit. It's an investment to them. They have no intention of living there. It's just a business transaction to them. And most of the investors that we dealt with were highly respectable. They were ethical. They dealt with people as they should be dealt with. But house flipping also had a very dark and seedy side to it as well. It was common for some buyers to target elderly people, to target people who had just lost a loved one and might need to be selling their house. They targeted people who lost their jobs and had financial trouble. And so they would convince these people that I got your best interest at heart. Trust me, I'm your friend. I'm going to fix your problem for you. And they would buy these houses for much, much, much less than fair market value. I mean, it wasn't even close. And all that did was increase their profits. The cheaper they could buy the house, the more money they could make. So you may be thinking now, okay, that's terrible, that somebody would do that to somebody else. That's not good. But what does this have to do with coveting? Not only did those buyers have an inordinate desire to get something that they didn't have, that wasn't theirs, they got these things by injustice and oppression. Martin Luther clearly had this type of offense in mind when he said, this goes back to the meaning of the 10th commandment, we should fear and love God, that we do not scheme to get our neighbor's inheritance or house in a way which only appears right. That hits the nail on the head right there. These buyers were going after people who really didn't know any different or were not in a position to make an informed decision because they wanted these things. They coveted these things. They were getting them in a way that was not right, but trying to convince people that they were doing right. So they obviously coveted these houses and were getting them by false means. Using these same examples of King Ahab and house flippers, we can see two other sins that resulted from their covetous actions. In both cases, Ahab and house flippers, their actions led to lying, which is bearing false witness against your neighbor, and theft, stealing. Jezebel lied to the people about Naboth so they could steal his vineyard. The house flippers lied to their victims, again, bearing false witness, to get their houses under false pretenses, which, if we recall from the meaning of the seventh commandment, you shall not steal, it says theft includes acquiring things by dishonesty, fraud, or taking advantage of others. Very clear that both of these situations, Ahab and the house flippers, lied. They bore false witness against their neighbors, and they stole. One final evil that I want to talk about related to coveting is greed. Jesus speaks to this in John 12 when he says, "Take care, be on your guard against all kinds of greed, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of possessions." Jesus is being very emphatic in these words. It's hard to tell when you just read the verse in the Bible. Yes, the version that I had an exclamation point after it. So yes, there was emphasis there. But it's interesting when you look at the Greek words that were used in this verse. One of the commentaries that I use, obviously I don't know Greek. I get my information from commentaries a lot. And the commentary that I was using said that the word for take care can also be translated as watch out. That kind of gives you a different take on it. And then be on your guard can also mean beware. So Jesus is really trying to make a point in this verse. Watch out, beware, take care, be on your guard against greed. Jesus follows this warning with a parable that we're all familiar with. It's the parable of a rich man who his land produces a bountiful crop. And he tells them, what am I going to do with all this, all these crops? I'm going to tear down my barns. I'm going to build bigger ones so I can store everything, so I can take life easy, so I can relax and enjoy the fruits of my labor. But God tells him, this very night, your life is going to be required of you. Does God not want people to be prosperous? This man didn't appear to be evil. He no doubt worked hard to get his land to produce the crops that it did. He didn't get anything or appeared to have gotten anything by ill-gotten gain. So what's the problem? The problem is that this man was only giving himself credit for his blessings. He didn't thank God for the abundance of his blessings. He took complete credit for everything. Possessions became his God. He is, as Jesus says in the parable, not rich toward God. So God's not anti-wealth, but you've got to have the proper perspective and understand who the true source of your earthly blessings is. You have to maintain that perspective, and you have to recognize that what we have is God-given. It's nothing that we have done. Everything we have is a blessing from God. So this parable is telling us one of the evils of greed, one of the downsides of greed, is that it tends to make us focus on earthly things, on things of this world, instead of putting our focus where it needs to be, and that's the next world with God. Greed creates idols and makes fools out of us. It leads us to a bankrupt relationship with God. So for everything that I've said, it sounds like all the sins that we've talked about, bearing false witness, lying, stealing, whatever, these are all covered by other commandments. So why are we talking about, or why do we need commandments on coveting if everything seems to be covered already? And to answer that question, we have to go back and look at what was going on at the time when God gave these commandments to Moses. And those of you who have been here a lot and heard me before know that I refer to this as context. We have to look at the context that these commandments were given in. And the context is the Israelites lived in a very legalistic society. They had to follow very specific rules in their daily lives. And they believed that if they followed all these rules to the letter, if they did exactly what was required of them, then that was going to lead to their salvation. They were in good shape. Before we started this sermon series, some of us may have had the same kind of thoughts. I haven't killed anybody, I haven't committed murder. I haven't stolen anything. I haven't committed adultery. So I'm in good shape. I'm on the right track. The problem with that is, like we've talked about, there's a lot more to these commandments than those words. And we have found out through this sermon series that we're all guilty of everything. There's not a person in here who can say, according to what we have learned and heard over the last 9 weeks, that you haven't broken all of these commandments. I have. I'm sure you have too. But what God is saying here, the reason that we need these commandments on coveting, even though they lead to other things that are already forbidden, the reason that we need these commandments is it's not just the overt action of lying, cheating, stealing that makes us guilty. It's sinful to have those kinds of thoughts in your heart. And the writer of James puts it this way, saying, each person is tempted when he is lured and enticed by his own desire. Then desire, when it is conceived, gives birth to sin. And sin, when it is fully grown, brings forth death. So because of this, because all the commandments, all the commands that we have begin, or our breaking of them begins with something that's in our heart, in our minds, inside of us. And it's that thought that leads to the action. And so we need commandments against coveting to stop us, try to stop us from even having those kinds of thoughts. And the last thing I want to look at today in relation to coveting is how we can interpret this commandment in a way that's helpful to us and to others. As we've said before, all commandments have prohibitions, and that's what we've talked about today so far, is what is prohibited by coveting and all the other commandments as well. But this commandment too, like most of the others, also has benefits. It has ways that we can make a positive impact on our lives and others. And one positive thing that we can do is to be satisfied with what we have. Be happy with the possessions that God has blessed us with, that God has given us. Hebrews 13 tells us, keep your life free from the love of money, and be content with what you have, for he has said, I will never leave you or forsake you. And I was telling some people earlier, when I read those words this week, that just really jumped out to me and really stuck out in my mind. What a good and gracious God we have, who says, I will never leave you or forsake you. How reassuring is that to you? It really meant a lot to me. Another thing that we can do is to help our neighbors, help others hang on to what they've got. We can and should find ways to keep others be able to keep the possessions that they have. Or not just possessions, as the 10th commandment says as well, spouse. You could also include employees. The commandment mentioned man slave, female slave. That's kind of outdated in our world, but you can look at employees like that. You would not go around trying to steal somebody else's employees. But the scenario that I want to pose to you to think about this is you've got a friend, a married friend of the opposite sex. You've been friends a long time. You know them very well. And you have physical feelings for them. You are attracted to this person physically. Now, you would never do anything, you would never act on those feelings because you know that adultery is wrong. But one day, your friend comes to you and confides in you saying, I'm having some trouble in my marriage. Things are tough right now. And they ask you, what should I do? You have a decision to make. Do you tell them that you maybe need to consider going to professional counseling? Go to a marriage counselor, get some help. Do you ask them or offer to pray for them? Do you encourage them to work things out? Do you point out the positive things in their marriage, the things that are going good, to encourage them? Or do you try to put doubt and uncertainty in their minds, encourage them to leave their spouse so that you can satisfy your feelings for them? Obviously, you and I know what the right answer to that question is. Our commandments tell us we should assist our neighbors in keeping everything, whether it's a physical thing or a relationship or a person. Philippians 2:4 says, let each of us look not only to his own interests, but also to the interest of others. God has put us on this earth to be helpful to others, to let our neighbors see his love through us and through our actions. As we wrap up this journey through the commandments, I want to reiterate something that I said at the very beginning. At the very beginning, I said, yes, the commandments are laws. They are laws given to us by God. But we should not look at the commandments as I have to follow these laws to be saved. That's the wrong attitude. That's the wrong perspective. We should look at them as I get to follow these laws. I get to do what they say or what they ask because I want to do what's pleasing to God. It's not a have to, I get to. I want to show respect, admiration, appreciation for what God has done for me. And I'll close this message and this series by saying that God knows that we will never be able to keep all these commandments perfectly. He knows we're sinners. We've been sinners since our conception. There is absolutely nothing that we can do to save ourselves, to earn salvation. There's nothing we can do to make ourselves worthy of being in God's presence. And thanks be to God, we don't have to. He sent his only Son to do what we can't do. He lived the perfect life that we can't. He died to take away all of our sinfulness. He reconciled us to his Father. And he gives us the assurance of everlasting life with him in heaven. Amen.
Amen.